In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you the three most powerful mixing techniques, and I call these the Pro Mix techniques. And these techniques are used by every single music producer and engineer in the world, and you hear them every single day when you're listening to music or watching a movie or even a television show. Now, these three Pro Mix techniques are actually pretty easy to understand. But before you can start using these Pro Mix techniques, you'll need to understand a little bit more about the listener that's going to be hearing the audio. So chances are the music that you write or that you're recording is going to be heard by a person. Now, from the shoulders up, the human animal has almost two of everything, including two hemispheres of the brain, two eyes, two nostrils, and most importantly for our purpose, two ears. So I'm going to take this chap and I'm going to flip him around here so that we're looking at the back of his head so that his left ear and his right ear are the same orientation as our left and right ears. And then I'm going to chop him down the middle and I'm going to split his head into two separate components. So there's a left side and a right side. So now what we end up with is a left ear and a right ear. And those are the tools that the human animal uses to listen to everything, including your music. So in your studio, chances are you have a left and right studio monitor speaker. Now, each one of these speakers is directed towards the listener's left ear and the listener's right ear, as well as your left and right ears, so that you can hear what your end listener is going to be hearing through their tools or their ears. Now, there's a lot of spatial difference between the left and right ear of the human animal. They are on exact opposite sides of the head, so they are 180 degrees opposite from one another as far as where they are oriented on the human head. So that gives the human animal the ability to hear 360 degrees of sound around their head. So when you're recording music and you've got all of those tracks inside of Cubase, if you haven't done any volume changes or any panning or any other treatments on those tracks to this point, what you essentially have is a big blob of music. Now, believe it or not, this blob that you're looking at in the center of the screen right now is comprised of three different colors, which I'm going to use to describe three different types of instruments. But when you put them all in the center between the left and the right speaker, or in mono, if you will, then they all get kind of blurry and kind of hard to discern, and they all get mixed together, and it's hard to hear any individual instrument. So you're going to use these Pro Mix techniques to allow you and your listener to hear different components or different tracks inside of the music. So when a lot of new users get into music mixing, they think that it's just a matter of turning up the tracks as loud or as soft as they need to be heard. And while volume is one of the Pro Mix techniques that I'll be showing you here, it's not a very effective technique. There's a much better technique for doing these sorts of things. So let's talk about volume first. So if we were to turn up one of these elements, like this green element, then it gets bigger than the other elements. It gets louder than the other elements. But it's still going to be kind of nebulous in the mix. Just making something louder isn't enough, because chances are once you get one thing turned up, then the other things are going to be harder to hear. So if I were to turn up the blue element of this visual representation of music, then it's now louder than the other elements. And if I turned up the red element, then it's going to be louder than the other things too. So now it's a volume struggle, and that's why volume is the least effective Pro Mix technique, because you just can't turn things up and down to be able to hear them. You have to consider who's going to be listening to this particular piece of music, which is, again, the human animal who has two sets of listening tools, the ears. So what you're going to do is actually use the second Pro Mix technique, which is panning. With panning, what you do is you take each individual track and you pan it further to the left speaker or further to the right speaker, depending on how much separation you want between the tracks. So, for example, if we were to take the green element in this visual depiction and pan it over to the left, then the left ear is going to be able to hear that element better. And conversely, if we were to take the blue element and we were to pan it over towards the right speaker, now what we're doing is we're opening up that space of all of the tracks. Now, here's a really, really interesting concept that you need to understand. Each ear on the human animal hears things individually, and the ears process what's happening in the left ear separately from what's happening in the right. So the left ear processes information separately than the right ear, and it's the human brain that ends up putting that all together in a way that you can comprehend. So that's panning. When you pan instruments apart, they actually get easier to hear because each ear processes that spatial information separately. So we've talked about the first two ProMix techniques of volume and panning. And the last ProMix technique is EQ, or equalization or tone control. Now, with EQ, which is the term I'm going to be using throughout this course, you're actually going to be able to focus the attention of the listener on each individual track. And the basic tone controls would be things like the bass or low frequencies, and the mid-range frequencies like you're hearing in my human voice right now, and the high frequencies of things like sibilance. So the EQ in Cubase actually has 4 different segments: bass, low mid, and high frequencies. And essentially what you're going to be doing with that EQ is focusing the sound of each individual track. So if we were to EQ this green component over on the left here, as soon as we start to hone in on the frequencies that we want to hear in that particular element, look, it ends up being guitar. Now we can actually tell that it's guitars. And we could do the same thing with this red element. If we started to EQ those tracks, then we start to hear that they're drums and really start to focus in on the sound of each individual drum track. And then finally, if we change the EQ on this last element, then we will actually be able to hear that it's bass. So you can think of EQ as the focus of each individual track. So those are the 3 ProMix techniques that I'm going to be showing you throughout this course: volume, panning, and EQ. And by applying those 3 basic yet very powerful ProMix techniques, you're going to be able to make your mix sound much more professional in a much shorter amount of time. Now, I know I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit here, but I want to give you an idea of how powerful those ProMix techniques are. So I'm going to come back to this Impasse project, and I'm going to play a little bit of it, and bear in mind that there has been a little bit of mixing done during the recording process. So some things have had their volumes changed and the panning changed and maybe even some of the EQ changed. And to take a look at that, let's go into the Mix Console by going to the Devices menu and selecting Mix Console, or simply by typing F3 on the computer keyboard. So I'm going to type F3 and get to the mixer. And then I'm going to type F2 to drop my transport panel out of the way so that we can see a little bit more of the Mix Console. Now you can see right now, if I use this scroll bar at the bottom of the Mix Console to scroll across all of the tracks, you can see that the volumes have been changed on some of those tracks. In fact, most of the tracks have had some sort of volume adjustment, and some of the tracks have been panned as well. So if we were to listen to this project, it's going to be an okay, just basic work mix. So we start to get some of that separation that I talked about using panning, and we also get some of the level changes set with the volume adjustments, and there might even be some EQ adjustments to increase the focus of some of those tracks. But what I want to do is I want to get back to that white blob that you saw in that graphic earlier, where everything is just dead center and everything's turned up all the way. And I'm going to show you the difference between the two. So I'm going to go to this little drop-down box in the upper right-hand corner of the Mix Console, and I'm going to go to Reset Mix Console Channels. And then it's going to ask me if I want to reset just the selected channels, but I didn't make any selections. I just want to use this command to reset all of the channels. And now you'll see that all of the volume faders on those channels have gone back to the 0 position, and the pan controls have been set to the center position, and none of the EQs are on. So now that all of those tracks have been turned up, I'm going to drop the master fader down here quite a bit because this is going to make it very, very loud because everything's been turned up. And now when we listen to the project again, it's going to be much, much harder to hear any of the individual instruments because we've essentially removed all of the Pro Mix components from this project. Let's take a listen. So the guitars are way too loud, we can hardly hear the drums. Here come the vocals. So yeah, we can hardly hear the vocals. We've got tons of guitars, but more importantly, everything just sounds really like choked, like really, really constricted because everything is in mono right now because all of the pan controls have been set to the center position. Let's listen again. So that is a terribly boring mix. So throughout this course, we're going to be using those Pro Mix techniques and apply them to these tracks so that we can get a professional sounding mix. Now in the next tutorial, I'm going to spend a little bit of time with you about what you're looking at right now, which is the mix console.